We are meeting at a time that is very grave for Indian democracy with 2024 approaching. We are all worried what exactly is going to happen. 2024. Are they going to be general elections at all? If they are general, are they really going to be general, or are they going to be very specific in some character? So this is a worry that is looming large in nation, and you can imagine you guys are at least happy here south of India. As we are right in the heart of the storm in Delhi. Every day, people and regimes breathing down our neck. But all this can be said in terms of it's very clear the writing on the wall in terms of how authoritarian, how institutions are being undermined. But what I will wish to share with you, which I think is what we should focus on, is that unlike other populist authoritarian regimes, whether it's in United States, Trump has already been thrown out, and Professor Ram Kumar tells me that he's just been disqualified for the next elections. Bolsonaro has been thrown out in Brazil. Well, Turkey, Erdogan came back with 52%, and then we have this current regime in India. What is unique about the Indian case? How different is it in terms of that is where I think one hesitates that merely referring to the authoritarian and the fascist part of this regime may not be capture the complete picture. How are they able to produce the kind of social consent that are able to, even looking at the elections that just we got the results of the assembly elections in the 3 states. This regime seems to be looking at a long haul, and they're doing 2 things simultaneously. Breathing down, curbing institutional autonomy, the liberal part of it, top down is being, there's an authoritarian push down. But from bottom up, they are very conscious in terms of pursuing the democratic, electoral, participatory methods, and would want to come back to power through electoral means. So how is that they're able to manage to do both the things? That at one end the regime looks so authoritarian, dictatorial and fascist, but on the other end they are also being democratic, participatory and getting electoral mandate and social consent. This is the dilemma that we should really look at. Otherwise, what will happen is that we will be only responding to one part of the problem, which is the overt part. But there is an underlying part of generating tacit consent. And this tacit consent, in a very worrying way, has been, in terms of the social base of BJP RSS, has been growing wider and wider. That it has moved to Dalits, OBCs, in the recent elections, STs, and they're also now laying a pitch to certain sections within Muslims. So this is something that we need to really understand, that when we began as a secular democracy, we thought that caste Hindus might be supporting right-wing populism because right-wing politics is broadly casteist and anti-minority. But the bottom end of the society, whether it is when Mandal Commission, the debate was Mandal versus Kamandal. And we thought that implementation of Mandal Commission was, Rajni Kothari referred to it as a secular upsurge. And Rudolphs and Rudolphs, some of you would know, political science students, said that we will essentially remain a centrist polity because of caste fragmentation. Therefore, India will never become a confessional majority state. But today we are staring of India becoming a confessional majority state. We are already typified at electoral autocracy. We have already been downgraded by we democracy. We are already moving towards some kind of an ethnic democracy. So the old presumptions that some of the political theorists and analysts made, that India's character is essentially centrist, it is this centrist character of Indian polity based on social fragmentation and cultural diversity and cultural heterogeneity. This is what is being subverted internally. Force and pressure is one part of it. India cannot be managed. India is too big to manage only through force, intimidation. The most worrying part is that this subversion of centrism, by extension of that logic, would mean subversion of democracy itself, is happening by appropriating the progressive principles, progressive liberal principles that we thought will strengthen democracy in India. So it is not that they are openly challenging all of liberal values. It is not that they are openly challenging all of constitutional values. It is not that they are completely violating participatory inclusion of different sections. It is by using the logic of liberalism, it is by using the logic of participation, it is by using the logic of representation, they're internally subverting and generating a monolithic authoritarian order. So diversity, language of equality, language of rights, principles of political participation, then become the templates, vehicles for emergence of an authority. And that is the real crisis. If it was an explicitly an authoritarian regime undermining institutions, undermining everything, then one can openly say this is a fascist and there can be a counter-hegemonic, counter-mobilization. But what do you do when principles of counter-mobilization are already appropriated by the regime? For that, we need to therefore understand it in a very close-up manner in terms of how they are subverting institutions and democratic logic in a way that it is actually lending them the possibility of greater social consent. In the recent assembly elections, they got their vote share has increased, and their vote share has increased in Dalits and tribal areas. So tribals, Dalits, OBCs. This is where the main chunk, 2019 data, if you look at 33% of Dalits, 42% of OBCs voted for the BJP across the country. So today their reach is across castes, across regions, across the linguistic diversity. So all that we thought that diversity will be a natural check on an emergence of a monolithic majoritarian order, simply kind of, it's just collapsing in front of our eyes. How are they able to do that? So if you look at the caste question, today BJP is at the forefront of providing representation to all the smaller castes. The earlier Congress centrist model had the politics of accommodation kind of a model. They generated small elites among each caste and gave them representation. Today what BJP is doing is that subdividing the OBCs and the Dalits into smaller jatis, into smaller subcastes, and providing those smaller subcastes who are weaker within Dalits, who are weaker within OBCs representation to challenge the hegemony not only of the upper caste but hegemony of the dominant caste within OBCs and Dalits. From a distance, this actually looks very progressive, this is very transformative. Dare I say, this is even very revolutionary for Indian democracy. Look at the new appointments of chief ministers in the 3 states they won. At one place it is an Yadav, one is a tribal, in third place of course it's a Brahmin. What Congress could not do in 50 years, this regime demonstrated doing in 10 years. But what is the catch? Does this then mean that this regime is really democratic? That this then mean that this regime does not believe in a Brahmanical, hierarchical social order? No, it does believe. That is the core character of the RSS. But what they are doing is that by giving smaller and weaker subcaste more representation, one, they are internally dividing these castes so that you don't have consolidated Dalits or consolidated OBCs. They become internally fragmented. That internal fragmentation is happening by legitimately challenging the dominance and hegemony of the dominant powerful groups within OBCs and Dalits. So if you look at Telangana recent result, they won all the 4 assembly seats in the tribal belt in Adilabad. How did they do that? Tribal ST reservations for last so many decades, most of it was the benefits went to one subcaste of the Lambadas. So RSS mobilized the other smaller tribal groups against the Lambadas, and therefore they got the support of the rest of the tribals within STs. Further, what this does is, once these OBCs and Dalits and STs are internally fragmented, hegemony of the dominant groups is subverted, then the resistance to the hegemony of caste Hindus, the powerful caste Hindu caste, also becomes weakened. Because you do not have consolidated OBC, you do not have consolidated Dalit. But none of this you can say in principle is authoritarian. This is in one sense deepening of democracy. But what they are deepening in terms of representation, they are flattening out in terms of social recognition and redistributive politics. More representation to OBCs and STs simultaneously also means that more Hinduization of STs and OBCs. So more representation to Dalits along with the agenda of vegetarianism. So more representation is being depicted as being more inclusive into a social agenda which is essentially caste Hindu, which is essentially homogeneous, which is essentially top down. So it's a very complex and a complicated business of what RSS has learnt in the last 100 years, and therefore they're able to successfully appropriate the principles of democracy, appropriate the principles of modern constitutional liberal democracy, and internally subvert them. That's the reason the opposition in India is still struggling. You might overtly refer to it as what they have done, dismissing all the MPs, can be referred to as authoritarian and illiberal. But that illiberality is happening at one end top down. From the bottom end, there is greater and greater lateral spread of representation. Where does the RSS and BJP get this confidence that increasing inclusion of Dalits, OBCs, STs will still allow them to Hinduize and push an Hindutva agenda and reinforce a Brahmanical hierarchical social order is a question we need to think. That how are they confident that this representation is not going to make substantive difference to the social agenda of this nation? So more representation without recognition and without redistributive policies. So they're internally emptying out the process of representation, but electoral terms, it becomes very attractive for subaltern castes to move closer and closer to BJP's and for voting to BJP and going closer to their social agenda. In other words, greater support to Hindutva agenda would mean greater chance of more representation. So if you look at the Hindi hard belt, including even Telangana, they're giving greater representation to tribals, but it is also resulting in greater Hinduization of tribals. So they are today saying that Lord Shiva is essentially a god who represents the tribals. His lifestyle, that is, he has no possessions, he lives in faraway places, is not in the mainland. All these myths and stories and mythology becomes a source through which they are culturally Hinduizing but providing them political representation. So this is on the question of caste. If you look at on the question of institutions, Professor Shaji already mentioned the attack on federalism. Look at they are withholding funds to Telangana, to Bengal, to Kerala. Wherever they have not won, they explicitly withhold. GST, one nation, one market. All of this undoubtedly is at the heart of how they have undermined the federal structure, and Article 371 was a big blow, a final blow. But even if you look at question of federalism closely, BJP was one party which was at the forefront of supporting formation of smaller states. In the earlier round, they support the formation of Chhattisgarh and Jharkhand. In the recent, they were at the forefront of support for Telangana. In fact, some of the left parties were withdrawing their support to formation of Telangana, but BJP was at the forefront of formation. What is the logic? That how does a party which does not believe in a federal structure, which believes in certain kind of centralization, which believes in certain kind of unification, how is that they support smaller states? Again, the logic is similar to that of the caste. That if you create more and more smaller states which have less and less number of MPs, then the center by default already becomes strong. Greater spread, like the northeastern states. Why is their presence and policy and policy allocation, why is that northeast remains neglected? It's because it returns very few MPs. So their presence in the policy making is very, very limited. So they use this logic to internally subvert even in terms of federal setup. And that is also by and large their idea of policy making. I co-authored a longish piece on how social policy is being used for right-wing populism in the Hague Journal, Development and Change. Those of you interested should look up. And the entire logic is this, that they show the limitation of policy frame of the previous UPA government. Undoubtedly, there are limitations. In all regimes, there would be limitations of policy framework. But replace it with either no policy or far worse policy with far worse outcomes than the UPA regime. Take schooling, for instance. Under this regime, in the last 7 years, the data shows that 72,000 government schools have been closed down. This data is available on Niti Aayog. What is the logic? They are saying that the logic is rationalization of resources. Wherever there are government schools with one teacher, wherever there are schools with greater dropout rates, to rationalize resources, consolidate at single place for greater outcomes, we are closing down government schools. Does it make any sense? If you have greater dropout rates and if you have schools with poor infrastructure, common sense will tell you that you recruit more teachers, give more infrastructure. But here the government says that because there is poor infrastructure, we will. So they show the dropout rates in the previous regime because of poor infrastructure and teacher recruitments, because poorly equipped teachers are being recruited on contractual basis. You come and criticize that, which is fair enough. But what do? You actually close it down. You show the leakages in MNREG to actually stop allocating funds to MNREG. So this is the entire logic of the regime works in this way, that you externally delegitimize to internally subvert. Your national education policy, the entire NEP document actually flows on this logic, which, it is simply astounding that a national education document has given more number of options to drop out from schooling than to continue education. Nowhere in the world this must have happened. And this they are propagating as an achievement. This they are saying is actually giving freedom to the pupils. You can drop out at 8th standard, 10th standard, 12th standard. You may not even join school because you have full freedom. So not getting an opportunity for education is shown as autonomy of, and they're redefining autonomy of institutions in terms of withdrawal of government funding. So any institution which wants more autonomy, this is what they told us in JNU, because we talk about autonomy of institutions. They're saying that you can have your autonomy, and that autonomy government will not interfere. What does interference mean? Government will not fund you. So look at the logic of how they have subverted the language of autonomy and of democratic spaces. So your NEP, if it was implemented in the next 10-15 years, this is what it is going to do. You will have greater and greater dropouts, greater number of public schools will be closed down. And if you have seen, Mr. Mohan Bhagwat recently gave a statement saying that there is greater unemployment in India because we do not have dignity of labor in India. So if you combine that statement with the policy provisions in NEP, what does it mean? It means that most of these castes at the lower end, which cannot afford education by themselves, will be pushed back to their caste occupations. So this is a much greater ideological struggle, that caste is being today justified in terms of culture. This is a very long debate. I don't have time to get into, but this goes back right to the heart of Gandhi's interpretation of caste. Those of you interested should look up Akhil Bilgram's very interesting piece on Gandhi and the vexed question of caste. So even on the question of caste, they are arguing that it is not merely about hierarchy, but caste is also about culture, which is partly true. Caste includes certain food habits, certain cultural practices. Therefore, preservation of caste is preservation of certain heterogeneity, and that is their critique of liberal modernity. And this was essentially a Gandhian take on caste. And this has a powerful appeal on the ground for SCs, OBCs and Dalits. And this, as I said, goes back to Gandhi. I don't have time to get into the details. Third, on the question of religion. You might say that, this is an anti-minority, this is all about majoritarianism, religious majority. But if you observe closely, what are the justifications? Recently, UP government proposed banning halal products. I don't know how many of you have followed this in South. And the logic they often give to banning is that it's a question of hygiene, it's a question of scientific. Is there enough science to prove that halal is a better or a more hygienic or a more healthy way of preparing food? South Delhi Municipal Corporation banned public display of meat. Public display of meat, they are saying is because there is dust, it is unhygienic. So they've already appropriated modern language of science, hygiene, health. It's like during COVID, people were posting on Facebook saying that, see, Hindus already knew touch would spread. So that's the reason we do only namaste and do not shake hands. Of course, Muslims responded saying that we also knew, therefore our women wear burqa from right from the beginning. We were making masks before COVID came. So this is what it is getting reduced to. All modern scientific discourses are being reappropriated. This is what we refer to in political theory as regressive modernism. Modern principles are being used for justifying regressive social conservatism. This is the heart of the crisis of modernity we are facing. And right-wing populism, right-wing authoritarianism is a very perverted expression of this inner crisis. So if you look at the even question of triple talaq, what was the logic? It was about women's rights. What ideally secular parties should have done. But if you look at the details of how they went about banning triple talaq, they criminalized Muslim man and did not give alimony to Muslim women. So you use a modern language of women's rights and disempower a community and criminalize an entire community. But for the majority community from a distance, this looks fairly justified. This looks like you are actually propagating women's rights, that you are appropriating the language of equality, you are appropriating the language of freedom. Finally, if you look at even on the question of Muslims, they are talking today, BJP is the first party to talk about Pasmanda Muslims. They are talking about caste within religion. There was an elaborate debate, and my own former teacher and colleague Imtiaz Ahmad, who recently passed away, was one of the few Muslim scholars who said long back in 80s and 90s that there is caste in Islam, there is practice of caste within Muslims, but most dominant secular scholars and Muslims refused and rejected this idea. Today it's the BJP which is telling us that there are majority are Pasmanda Muslims, and therefore there is a reach out of in Karnataka convention, in Karnataka BJP RSS convention, they talked about special reservation for Pasmandas within. But it's a different fact that most of the Muslims in North India who were mob lynched, the recent data shows that most of them were Pasmanda Muslims. So on one hand, you appropriate all modern democratic principles to internally fragment. So their notion is that the reason there is triple talaq and Pasmanda Muslims is to internally fragment Muslims while externally consolidating Hindus into one unified whole. So they are subverting the democratic principle from within. And finally, we come to the logic of securitization. Along all this, the topping on the cake is the securitization discourse. That you convert all democratic notions of dissent, that you normalize discontent and criminalize dissent by converting into securitization discourse. This whole nationalist, anti-national discourse. So on top of all this, on the debris of this democratic, internal subversion of democratic practices comes the securitization discourse. Anything that escapes this echo chamber of the RSS then is finally criminalized, it is in the web of the discourse of securitization. Therefore, all those social activists who go beyond this internal logic, whether it was the Bhima Koregaon case, they are all finally criminalized as anti-nationals. There is a large-scale securitization discourse that emerges, and the recent crisis is also because they want to change criminal justice procedure, the entire discourse of war on terror, the Tampering with Evidence Act. This went back to Justice Malimat Commission 10-20 years back, which was lying before Parliament. They're bringing it. Then there's whole fear of Kashmir, Northeast, fear of secession of Punjab. So at the top level is the entire criminalization of public discourse. The whole question of conspiracy, whole question of uncertainty, actively cultivating mistrust. Look at Prime Minister Modi's speech in Karnataka election. When they knew Karnataka BJP was facing a steep challenge, Mr. Modi goes there and says that Congress wants Karnataka to secede from India. So at the final layer is criminalization of all public discourse, criminalization of dissent, use of extraordinary laws. Look at Mr. Yogi Adityanath's method, that they show dysfunctional institutions, lack of conviction, ineffective judiciary, which is a fair critique. So how do you fight crime? You have an undeclared policy of fake encounters. So you show dysfunctional institutional setup to further delegitimize institutions. So you say that if finally judiciary will not work, it is ineffective, therefore only solution is go for extrajudicial killings. And once you establish the norm of extrajudicial killings, it is not going to stop with Muslims or criminals. This is going to become the norm of governance. This is going to be exception as a paradigm of governance, which is what we are seeing. This bottom-up participatory model is then converted when it comes into an extrajudicial. So it's a very deft combination. And what this does, again, I don't have the time to get into the details, but what it is doing is creating a new apartheid state in India. That they are normalizing and establishing a norm that there will be different set of norms for different social groups. That there will be different set of norms for different political parties. Forget common people, they don't bother about even opposition leaders. So they establish this norm that their leader will speak and abuse a Muslim, but there will be no disciplinary action, but there will be disciplinary actions Mahua Moitra. So what is that they want to project? They want to project that if you are with us, you are above law. If you are not with us, then the law will chase you. If you are not caught in the law, then they will implicate you in some case. So this is creation of an apartheid state. But the most worrying part is that you create an apartheid state, unlike in South Africa, which was explicitly unfair, and which is why a counter mobilization was possible. This is a state which is creating this model by attuning itself to the social norms, by increasing participation, by including the subaltern castes and even castes within religious minorities. And there is a greater and greater propensity that this might work. That earlier assumptions that we made, simple-minded assumptions that if you are a Shudra or if you are a Dalit, you are going to be necessarily anti-Hindu and anti-Hindutva, is not something that is getting naturally reflected. Tamil Nadu could be one exception, Kerala could be partly an exception. Even in Kerala, if you look at their strategy, it is very similar. They have already approached Syrian Christians. Syrian Christians are gradually moving to BJP and RSS. They are internally dividing religious minorities. Christians will target Muslims. Within Muslims, they will raise question of gender, as they did in Sabarmala case. Within Muslims, they will raise a question of caste. So the way forward will have to be that we'll have to rethink this question of internal hierarchies within caste and religion. That secular progressive discourse of the past disallowed us from looking at these discourses. So in my own writings, I refer to this as secular sectarianism, that our secularism, the way we followed it, the outcome was that we created sectarian silos within subaltern castes, and which is what BJP is today, RSS is further reaping. How do we then give space to this heterogeneity within caste and religion, yet not allow it to convert into a monolithic order? This is the challenge, because that is the principle we believe would actually challenge monolithic authoritarian order. But we are seeing today that recognition of that heterogeneity itself is leading to production of an authoritarian monolithic top-down order. And this is not an easy challenge to take up. And therefore RSS is very confident, whether they win 2024 or whether they lose, they are very confident because they feel that they have got hang of they have subverted the social logic internally. And that's the reason why opposition parties, even left parties, are struggling at the national level to produce a counter narrative, because our entire counter narrative of secular progressive left discourse was based on this logic of politics of difference, of this logic of heterogeneity, of this logic of cultural diversity. Once that has been subverted, our search has to begin all over again. That what do we do with this? How do we recombine the question of representation with recognition and redistribution? That is a long talk, and to share that, Naveen has to invite me again to. With that, I stop. Thank you.